let's catch up on the politics of the day, particularly around the economy and other stuff with Lord Hayward, who's a Conservative peer and pollster. Lord Hayward, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the economy or anti-LGBT Lego?
Let's start with the economy.
Okay. Yeah, so you're sensible.
I think it's fair to say that rarely has an interest rate cut been met with more negative news coverage. Normally there's headlines saying benefits for homeowners, mortgage holders and the like. But on this occasion, it's actually the revised economic forecasts that the Bank of England came out with at the same time, saying, look, we're going to slash the growth figures, the prospects are looking bad, the headroom for overall tax cuts is disappeared. The overall assessment is just so negative that it isn't any surprise that actually one of the pollsters today have come out with the worst confidence figures in the government since the general election, and the events of yesterday probably indicate that they'll get worse.
Yes, and of course this is against a backdrop of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer talking incessantly before the election and in order to get elected, and then since, about growth and putting more money in people's pockets. That the Labour Party are apparently, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here with big inverted commas, the saviour of Britain's economy, that they're going to rescue it. You may have heard Sean Woodward earlier on, one of your old colleagues, talking about how this is all the Conservatives' fault, even though of course the economy was recovering before the election in July. So the Labour Party don't seem to be listening, frankly, and don't seem to be doing anything any differently than perhaps they've always done by way of their ideology. But let's just be very, very clear, Robert, can we, in terms of the seriousness, I think, of what Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, said yesterday in his comments as a consequence of him and the MPC reducing interest rates to 4.5%. And by the way, two members of that monetary committee wanting to cut interest rates by 0.5%. That's how serious those two individuals think the economy is in terms of its performance. So we're in a situation now where, and I would argue, and I think the Bank of England governor didn't quite go this far, but I would argue that as a consequence of Rachel Reeves' decision since July, and particularly in the budget in October, particularly with that £40 billion extra tax burden on Britain, that we have ended up going backwards. GDP, as in the measure of how big our economy is in reverse, and inflation, of course, that spectre, inflation starting to increase again. The Bank of England saying that growth in 2025 will be half what they thought it was going to be just a few weeks ago, so only 0.75%, but really worryingly, that growth reduction will be kind of married to an increase in inflation, what we used to call in the old days stagflation.
Yes, you've carried on where I left off, all the other bits of bad news that were in the Bank of England's overall analysis. And that is the daunting aspect of this. And I think for the average person out there, the negativity, which we saw, as you say, before the budget, then the response to the budget. But even now, the problem for the government is that they're saying, well, we're taking tough decisions. But what do they do? At the same time, they're talking about a huge sum of money in relation to the Chagos Islands. Now, most people don't know where the Chagos Islands are. They've no idea why there should be such a huge sum of money going to Mauritius. And that's when, at the same time, you're saying you can't have winter fuel allowances, you've got to have increase in national insurance contribution, just everything you can imagine.
And there's a real, but Robert, there's a real dichotomy there. And it's hard for all of us to understand how the government can talk about, just a few days after being elected, that there was all of a sudden this black hole that they didn't know about, even though, as you well know, those books, the government books, would have been open and available to them for months before the election. So that we're not really buying, as indeed the Office of Budget Responsibility are not buying, this whole £22 billion black hole thing. But as I said to Sean Woodward, how do you square the circle when you're talking to a 70-year-old pensioner in a cold lounge in Newcastle and you tell them that you've taken away their £300 winter fuel allowance? How do you explain that alongside also explaining that even though there's no money, we are sending, as you say, £18 billion to Mauritius to pay them to take something that we own, £22 billion in carbon capture, which most people agree doesn't work or certainly is not proven. And then, of course, £8 billion a year in foreign aid, plus another £15 billion to help other countries with climate change. I mean, you can forgive, Elsie Smith from Newcastle thinking, well, why can't you give me my 300 quid when you've just given £40 billion away?
Well, the interesting thing is, and Nigel Farage is making a great fuss about the opinion polls, it's fair to say that broadly at the moment, you've probably got three major parties together in opinion polls. But those are measuring static people and when they're not actually having to put a cross against a name in a ballot paper. Yesterday, there were by-elections in some essentially Labour areas in Rochester, in Gillingham, in Lancashire.
Council elections.
And the Labour Party, sorry?
Council elections.
Yes, but council by-elections, where previously sitting councillors have stood down. And what happened? Labour lost 3 seats. Reform gained 3. Now, there was a switch. The Conservatives gained 1 and lost 1. But the net result, the real big headline is Labour loses 3 seats, essentially in Labour areas, and came close to losing the other one in Gillingham. And this is the message that people are really delivering week in, week out in council by-elections.
Well, and this is why, Robert, that we've got a Prime Minister that seems intent on cancelling as many local elections in May as he possibly can. But I have to say, the Conservatives also supported it. Certainly in my county of Essex and in Hampshire, the Conservatives have voted alongside the Labour politicians that they sit opposite. They're all voting for this because they're all scared of losing their seats to Reform.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's quite a fair analogy. There is no question we have one hell of a mess in local government at the moment. Depending on where you live, you have 1 council, 2 councils, you have town and parish councils, you might have regional mayors, and therefore there needs to be some restructuring. But the Lib Dems and Reform have both said, oh, you're taking away our democratic rights. As you say, Essex is one of the places where that's happening. But there's no question that local government needs restructuring. It's something that has been going on for a while. I'm not unhappy that the announcement has been made that we're going to restructure local government. What I am at a loss to understand is why you do it piecemeal in Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk, but you don't do it at the same time in Kent or Hertfordshire.
Because I would venture, as a bit of a conspiracy theory here, that these are the areas that the Conservatives and Labour are most concerned about in terms of losing councillors. I think there's a connection there that we've just got to join the dots. Let's move on, though, Robert, if we can. Let's talk about Kemi Badenoch and her attempts over the last day or two to placate the Conservative base a little by coming out with the following, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, with regard to migrant workers, that she would insist, if she were Prime Minister, that about half of them, given their lack of earnings, them not hitting the earnings threshold, half of them would be barred from staying in the UK under her plans. This is just a little sticking plaster, isn't it? It's not really going to make any difference to Kemi Badenoch's appeal from the grassroots, is it?
No, I think it's the first step on what everybody would expect to be a long series of comments. You had the first step, which was before the announcement of this part of immigration policy. You had the announcement that, look, we made a lot of errors. We, the Conservative Party, whether it's Kemi Badenoch or whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, made a lot of errors, particularly in the last few years of their administration. We're now looking at it anew. The comments about immigration are a part of what I would expect to be a long developing process over the coming months or the next year, 2 years, of policies that they will put forward at the next general election.
But the question I have to ask, Robert, is are the Conservative base, those voters that have traditionally voted Conservative, are now disappointed in the Conservatives, and obviously that reflected in the general election result in July. Are Conservative voters going to be convinced by these new platitudes from Kemi Badenoch as they develop over the next few months?
Not in the short term. You don't change people's minds. The one message that there was at the general election was, we don't want the Conservatives. There was no message, we want the Labour Party or anything else. There was just, we don't want the Conservative Party. You don't, in any opinion polling analysis, turn that sort of perception round in a matter of weeks or months. It takes you years to do so. So, as I said just now, this is what I would expect to be the first step over a period of the next year or two. People are not going to respond just to one message on one day. They need messages over months, if not over a year, year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, and not just messages, Robert. I mean, obviously some robust, traditional Conservative policies when it comes to immigration. You as a party have got to out-reform reform. You've got to get some of those reform voters, as they are now, that were Conservatives, and indeed Labour voters that are concerned about immigration, which is a fair chunk. We go back to the Brexit vote of 2016. Most Labour constituencies actually seem to vote for Brexit. So I think there's a proxy there in terms of how dyed-in-the-wool old-school Labour voters feel about immigration. You've got to, as a party, Kemi Badenoch has got to not just talk the talk. I mean, she's got to make it compelling, hasn't she, to get those voters back on immigration?
Yeah, I'm not talking here as a Conservative. I'm analysing the polls and people's the public's attitudes. What happened in the run-up to the last election, and you can measure it in the opinion polls, is that, first of all, the public lost confidence in the Tory party's competence to run the country.
Yeah.
Having decided that the Conservatives were incompetent, people went in one of two directions. They went to reform / abstain, or they went towards Labour / Lib Dems. The people who moved towards reform and abstention, for them, immigration was a dominant issue in their minds. For the people who went towards Labour and the Lib Dems, it was NHS and climate change were issues that influence the direction. But the first instance was competence / the economy, and then the population diverged. And that's why the Conservatives have to get a message about immigration across to a large section of the population. But I think it's worthwhile just commenting on one other thing. Reform voters are clearly not just solely Conservative voters. There is a fair proportion of them, and we will see it in May in the elections in places like Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Lancashire, that a fair amount of Reform voters are actually strong ex-Labour voters.
Yeah, indeed. And just quickly talk about the polls. I want to ask you about Liz Kendall in a second, and a rare slither of sense from a Labour frontbencher. But let's come back to that in a second. When it comes to polling, the Reform performance right now is, in some polls, of course, Reform are more popular than both the Labour Party and the Conservatives. What do you think that translates to if there were a general election in the next few days in terms of Reform seats? Because, of course, what the polls say and actually what parliamentary seats look like are two rather different things, aren't they?
Absolutely. And Nigel Farage is quite reasonably playing up the poll that gives Reform the biggest percentage. He's not identifying those where the Conservative, over the last 48 hours, there's been 3 different polls and they've produced 3 different results. What one can say is there is a very clear indication of the areas where Reform support is coming from. Your county is one, North Kent is another, but particularly North Kent. But then you look for Reform in the Midlands, the old industrial heartlands, the coal mining belts, South Yorkshire.
And Wales, Robert? Wales, I think, has got seen a surge in Reform support, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And it's the same sort of background. It's the coal mining, industrial, what demographers call the white working class vote, which is quite definitely moving towards Reform.
So basically it's everywhere apart from London and the southwest.
No, there's an awful lot of counties that you can...
That's pretty inspiring for Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got the whole of the southwest. You've got places like Hampshire and Sussex and Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, and you go into the rural Midlands and Shropshire, and even in Wales. It's specifically parts of Wales. We're not talking about other parts of it. And then you go to Cumbria. So no, each of the political parties, and I here include the Lib Dems as well,
I remember them.
has territory which is going to look attractive to them at a general election. But let's be realistic. The general election is not going to be for another 4 years.
It's not. It's a long, long time. I mean, a day in politics now, let alone a week in politics, is a long, long time. 4 years is, yes, a political lifetime, I guess. How hard would it be, based on, and I asked this because at the beginning of the show, I was talking to somebody about their prediction that Reform will form the next government. And no matter how much you think that you might want them to, that's a pretty tall order from a base of 5 MPs. How unlikely is that in terms of Reform having to end up with, what, 320 or so, 326 MPs? How unlikely is that from this this current 5 MP foundation that they've built?
It's unlikely in that they get to a certain point and they do very well. They leap dramatically from 5 through to 70 or 80, and then there's another dramatic point taking them to 150 stroke 170.
This is seats, yeah?
In seats, sorry,
yeah.
Yes. What happens then depends on the willingness of the anti-reform voters to form a coalition, not so much with the Conservatives or which part of the Conservatives, but between Labour and Liberal Democrats in particular, and whether they're willing to cross their votes over backwards and forwards, and what base they work on.
Yeah.
So it is a complex possibility, particularly because there are parts of the population, rather like Boris Johnson, the population, there are some that love Nigel Farage, but there's actually more that loathe him. And it's a question of whether those people will transfer those votes.
Let's see. And Robert, just quickly before you go, the comments from Liz Kendall, who is the Work and Pension Secretary, saying that long-term sickness is not an automatic reason not to work. As a Conservative, I suspect you'd agree with her, wouldn't you?
I would agree with her completely. We've seen a huge jump post-COVID in terms of the number of people on sickness benefit, and we've got to change that as a society. There's lots of things we've got to change, and that is just one of them.
Yep. Lord Hayward, thank you very much, as ever, Conservative peer and pollster. He'll be back with us soon, no doubt.